Hi, everyone. This is Richard McCarthy. On this episode of Mustafa's podcast, we dive into all sorts of issues related to farmers markets, pirates, and the future. Join us.
Thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. I am Mustafa Sharif, an urban planner, and you're more than welcome to join my big journey of exploring the making of smarter and more livable cities. Please don't forget to follow Urbanistica on the different social media platforms, and also let's connect on LinkedIn. Big thanks to Urbanistica podcast partner AFRI. AFRI is an international engineering and design company providing sustainable solutions in the fields of energy, industry, and infrastructure. Are you ready for a new episode? Let's go for it. I have the pleasure to welcome you, Richard, to Urbanistica podcast. Hey, and welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
How are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful.
So should I say welcome back from summer vacation or enjoy your summer vacation?
Oh, yeah. Welcome back to another good day on the planet. I did. I've had small interludes of technology detox and tried to turn off all of my machines and enjoy the actual environment I was in. And we don't do that enough.
So where are you now? In which city?
I am actually in New York State in a fascinating ecosystem, little bioregion called the Finger Lakes. And this is about 5.5 hours outside of New York City, in a region with these very deep glacier lakes that have become a place, like a sub-national place called the Finger Lakes. And I'm in a small town of Geneva. So I'm seeing at a scale how urban connects to rural in a way that is manageable.
Yeah. So how far is it from New York City, like from the downtown?
I don't actually know how many miles, maybe 300 miles. But it's far away. It's closer to Canada. It's closer to Toronto than New York City. The accents are different. People's perception of time and seasons is different. It's and it's this extraordinary wine growing region, which is becoming more known, but it's still relatively unknown. Sort of. So it's
yeah. So Richard, tell us more about you. How would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about your passion?
Well, I am now I guess quarter century long food systems activist or advocate. I grew up in New Orleans, a city that is drawn to pleasure and humor and tragedy, and I am something of a kind of a refugee from the social justice movements, where my background and the way I see everything in the world is with a political framework, and was active in very, I mean, this is going back many years ago, active in racial justice, environmental justice, labor justice issues. And I began to feel that this was a trap. Not that fighting in that traditional way doesn't work, but it stopped working for me as I began to feel the poison of what I was fighting against. And and also began to recognize that people are not necessarily drawn to strong ideological positions, although look around the world today and I wonder, um, but that everyday people are really interested in practical elements that change their lives and make their everyday life, the sort of revolution of everyday life, better. And I really withdrew from a lot of the activism that really motivated me during the first Gulf War, fighting David Duke, a neo-fascist politician in Louisiana, um, and it was largely because people are not looking for the fight; they're looking for a glimpse of the world they want to live in, and uh, and we need to meet people where they are. And so I fell into food quite accidentally as a urban gardener, a sort of guerrilla gardener. It changed the whole relationship I had with my neighbors, um, with where my food comes from, and I found it very, it's sort of corny, but I found it very healing. And from there, I really reimagined what activism means, and that instead of fighting the old world, what if we grow a new one? And from there, I began to join forces with the Black Farmers Organization in the Deep South, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, and who really mentored me to begin to learn about rural issues. So I have no reason to be a rural advocate. I've always lived in cities, uh, but I began to listen and learn um, what their needs were, and from there began to develop farmers markets, not as an endpoint, but as a starting point. And that really just transformed my whole trajectory. Um, and as a result, I think I am someone who is both hyper local and hyper global. And it's the linkage between the issues of food and pleasure and responsibility and uh, people and relationships and infrastructure. And so I began to present myself as an economic development specialist, which I guess in some ways I sort of became a community economic development specialist, and began to develop a new infrastructure based on a newfound trust between urban and rural people through food. And in a place like New Orleans, which has never been, well, not never been, in the 20th century, had been largely a failure, a shrinking city, um, because it would not embrace the homogenizing, globalizing elements of post-World War II life, where we just all eat the same standardized food. But this sort of reactive resistance to joining in that American bounty. I found that food is such an interesting point of intervention, because it would unite the most unlikely partners who would share in the defense of traditional foods. So we found this strange place between the libertarian left and the libertarian right, and I like that space because it's together we begin to build a new kind of politics. But it's not a politics based on strong ideas. It's based on a different theory of change, which is based on our behavior. How can we change our behavior? And then from that, we begin to develop a new shared history, new relationships. And from there, we begin to rekindle a social contract that has, when you look around the world, increasingly we've lost, and we're breaking, and we don't know how to put back together. And I think it's through food that we could do that, but that means putting aside many of the assumptions that we have aside, and to not be afraid to maybe learn again.
Because this is what I wanted to ask you also, Richard. Like, when you decide to like work with food as an element, was it like a moment you reflected and you'd be like, okay, so food is the answer, or no, it just happened that okay, you went into this field?
Uh,
Because you were involved in so many different platforms, organizations, and
I don't think it was certainly. I mean, we now look back at the last 25, 30 years, and one of the organizations that I have now long been associated with, Slow Food. Slow Food was a movement that emerged in the late 1980s as an interesting, very innovative idea that food could play a different role in our society and in our economy and in our imagination. Well, this is the late 1980s. We still were in the Cold War. There was no field, there was no food studies programs. It was a cog in a wheel. Food is about production and distribution. Food is fuel, is certainly the American way of looking, the North American way of looking at food. And instead, this marvelous Italian intervention said, heavens no, food is not fuel. Food is culture. Food is biodiversity. Food is dignity of ordinary people who work the land or work the kitchens. And that is that's a radical concept. It's crazy that it's a radical concept, but it's one that has now begun to build a field. So, to that whole question of, field, I think back then it was not a field. Most of my friends on the left, and I come from the sort of social change left. I was working in Jesuit university in a social justice center. And, it's like, how do you organize the next demonstration? And most of the people who were interested in that larger systems change said, well, what are you doing? This isn't changing the world. And of course, what I began to determine is that, no, this is precisely changing the world. In part, it changes us. But it begins to answer, it provides a place to reflect, not in a kind of navel gazing way, but to reflect on what are the hundreds of small decisions that we make in our daily lives that we have externalized, we've outsourced for others to make for us. How do we bring them back into our daily lives so that we move from consumer to protagonist? And I think that the culture, and I think this is a real question about the whole ideological culture of urban thinking, is that we are just consumers who consume the cities that we live in. And all the discussion is about what is our experience as a consumer, as opposed to being a protagonist in shaping the institutions and the relationships that make up our lives. And I guess that's what I saw as something that began to really make sense to me. This is in the 1990s, when I think, in a way, this is another period of time where the institutions that had shaped global life for, since the Second World War was the Cold War. There was East, there was West, and everyone else was collateral. But I think for me, food, the politics of food, I began to think about the politics of food much earlier than that, when I gave up meat when I was 15, because I did not want to be part of the industrial food system as it pertained to animals. But I didn't have a sophisticated construct to understand what are the systems of oppression and such, and so forth. But it was something just very instinctive. And so I guess, what speaks to you is probably more important than intellectually what kind of myths do we tell ourselves about the lives we lead and the decisions we make. It's much more, again, I think, about behavior than ideas that we lead with. And that for me was a big change.
Yeah. But do people really want to change, from a consumer, or no? It's I know maybe it's environmental, it's not good to be a consumer, but how about the culture and behavior? Do they really want to?
I don't think any of us like to change ever. Change is hard, and it makes it very difficult if you're in the work of any kind of change, fill in the blank, environmental change, any of the fill in the blank change, because we don't like to change. And especially on something like food, we are so, we feel it personally. It's part of, food that there's sort of this, we think of it as this mirepoix of social change, the French mirepoix of garlic, onions, peppers, and carrots. They're different mirepoix, but in the French mirepoix, I think for social change with food, it's that food is my identity. First, it gives me pleasure. Secondly, it's my identity, and then hopefully, third, it's a bridge to others. That whole relationship with food as my identity really strikes at the core of why we don't want to change. You're not going to take my food away. You're not going to take my hamburger away. You're not going to, this is my personal identity, and therefore also the dignity. However, people are very unhappy. Their lives are looking for deeper, stronger connections. We may not have the language for it, but our behavior tells us that in terms of how we spend our time. And Carlo Petrini, the founder of Slow Food, says, change the world, but don't do it with sadness, do it with joy. And I think the joy that comes with gardening, the joy that comes with shopping with others in the town square, whether it's a temporary town square or the historic town square where you have the market, these are moments where we discover the joy of food in our lives, not because of the food, but because of the other people, connecting with others, learning from others in a setting that is non-threatening, that is happy. I think it's an indication that people are willing to change, but the change should be an adventure. It should be something that adds value to your life rather than what tends to be the dismissive voice and point of view of public health experts who point their finger at you that you're doing something wrong and you must change. I don't think that works. I think it is, oddly enough, it is somewhat as your consumer experience. That may be what drives you there to do something, to learn how to cook, how to garden, learning about food from a region, learning about the seasons. We reconnect, and I think we recalibrate our lives, which have grown so out of whack as we work so hard, we work strange hours, we commute, all the kinds of questions that we have begun to ponder rather urgently, rather in a terrified fashion during the lockdowns of the pandemic. I think it really helped us to think, well, how should I be spending my time? Maybe I should be looking at the birds around me. But I don't think it's a question, or these are issues that are just for the luxury of those who have the time to think about them. It's how do we weave them into everyday lives of small farmers, vulnerable consumers. What we're discussing sounds rather lofty. I think what I was drawn to is the practical building blocks of building our everyday lives around new relationships where we recognize the dignity of each of us operating on, in these cities. And I think it is the importance of this municipal agriculture, whether it is food grown in the city or even maybe more excitedly, food grown near cities, and that there is a need for a new kind of infrastructure to bring that food in, and how that brings, ultimately yields in a new kind of resilience, where we have relationships that can weather the the shocks and the trauma that we are all sort of facing, whether it's feast or famine, fires or floods. If we have relationships and we have infrastructure that links us together, then we are stronger and we are happier. But the funny thing is that what drew me to developing the ancient mechanism of farmers markets, where a competitive assembly of independent vendors physically stand behind their products and sell the fruits of their labor to an open public, is the simplest, most ancient mechanism. And it's also the most available. It doesn't require a great deal of resources. It requires some imagination, verve, hard work, but it can be done. And it's in times where there is a lack of trust that this is an increasingly attractive pathway. And it's a pathway that opens up a door that can then open up so many other possibilities, in part because it's a public setting. And I think this is one of the great values of cities, is that we have the opportunity that we're crammed together in close proximity, that we can have involvement in each other's lives in this public setting that is orchestrated. It looks haphazard, it looks casual, it looks as though it's just sort of thrown together and it mushrooms up magically. But behind the scenes are professionals and volunteers who are reinventing these institutions, reinventing these moments and places where we are involved in each other's lives in a very easy manner. This is where we develop these weak social ties, where we walk onto the premises of the market. We may not know anyone's names. You just know them as the pie man or the mushroom lady. And you begin to you begin to develop a relationship. You may begin to ask questions. You may begin to ask questions with the people around you who are also queuing up for the products. And so it brings a sense of surprise and adventure into everyday life. And that curiosity, I think, is an appropriate setting to begin to ask the larger questions about our everyday lives. And I know it doesn't look intentional, and many of the organizers had not maybe intended all of these marvelous things to occur. But that social space is one in which people begin to feel comfortable with each other. Maybe not so comfortable that they're going to go on holiday together, but comfortable to begin to interact with people who are unlike themselves. Now, this is always the big question. Is it bonding with people like you, or is it bridging with people unlike you? And that requires some intentional organizing by the farmers market organizers to how to make the place accessible and welcoming to everyone. And these are the questions, of course, that of our age, of are we capable of embracing other people? Are we capable of creating pluralist societies where immigrants, refugees are sharing spaces with people who can count back how many generations have lived there? I think that farmers markets are one of these openings. There are others, but it's one that has become attractive and available. And while I've worked in this field and fell into it rather accidentally 25, 30 years ago, I am noticing today, and I playing a role in establishing this new international NGO, the World Farmers Market Coalition, as a Rome-based organization committed to the development of these civil society-led farmers markets, is that I am noticing an upswing of new farmers markets uh, being established in Europe, North America, South America. I mean, global North and South, and in particular in places where markets, public markets, may already exist, whether they're street markets, whether they're municipal markets. There is a great interest of sort of peeling away all the complications of the amazing wide array of places where we find food that they want these farmers markets. And what's rather satisfying, I guess, for me, having worked in this field and believe in these institutions, is that uh, they may seem small, insignificant, bourgeois, kind of tools of gentrification, fodder for automotive car commercials, all these sorts of caricature images of them. Underneath that, they are deeply radical institutions that build new social relationships. And I think the fact that there are newer and younger people recognizing this, and recognizing that they want to develop them, and recognizing that people want to shop in them, recognizing that farmers who feel frustrated by existing infrastructure want the direct contact to consumers. They want the direct contact to consumers because they want to learn. And so at the end of the day, this reinvented ancient mechanism is a platform for learning. And it's a learning. As consumers, we learn maybe what food means in our lives again. We learn how to cook again. As a farmer, you learn what consumers want. You learn from your competitor how else to present your products, which means you learn that your business is as much about marketing as it is production. And I think together we learn how to live in a community. And so the end product is community development.
Yeah. But is there like a room for this new farmers market in our cities?
Absolutely. And yet, it's a very good question. Is there a room for new farmers markets legally? In very hostile, actually, what's the word? In an environment that is a hostile regulatory environment, farmers markets are like pirate ships. They operate outside of the established code. There are problems of where do you place them? How do you license them? Is there zoning for them? How does VAT or sales tax operate? There's some very interesting questions in that they operate outside of the formal economy, and therefore they're informal. Now, the funny thing is, this is an age where we crave informality. For heaven's sake, we don't even wear suits and ties and dresses anymore. We only wear sweatpants, and tracksuits, because we are living in an informal age. We don't like to make reservations for dinner. We just want to show up someplace and embrace the informality. We're definitely in an upswing for informality. The informal economy means you don't exist, in sort of a legal framework. And therefore you are at odds with a regulatory environment that wants to pin down everything and make it formal. So it does require a great deal of creativity and verve and agility to develop institutions like farmers markets. And it requires a political set of skills to begin to navigate how might we operate a farmer's market on this church car park? How might we transform this intersection into a market, which would require closing the street, which would require all these kinds of complex issues. which means from the standpoint of the city administrators, how can they re-examine the urban scape as a platform to enable social cohesion and interaction and grassroots economic development? And how can they relax some of the rules, the laws that just govern our lives and send us down a pathway that's so narrow? Um, it's maybe a lot to expect. A city administration or provincial, whoever is regulating food and commerce. But my gosh, we can do better than harass street vendors who have so little opportunity in the economy that they are required to. The only opportunity they see is to set up shop on the street. Well, as a standalone street vendor, you're vulnerable. As part of a market, you have safety in numbers. You have competition, but you have safety. And so it does it does require the kind of social entrepreneurial verve of market organizers, which means we need to develop the skills of how do you navigate this space, so that our cities are not just straitjacketed, predictable mechanisms for consumption, but they become places where it's an adventure where we rediscover each other. And I think one of the best, most inspiring examples I can think of this sort of wisdom in municipal creativity is in Helsinki, a city that is known for its very rigid regulatory environment, but because of efforts led by civil society to launch Restaurant Day, where one day a year, although I think it has since grown to more than one day a year, all health regulations are relaxed, all VAT regulations are relaxed, and everyone is allowed to establish a restaurant one day a year in their living room, on their front porch. This is an extraordinary kind of idea to bring a sense of fun and adventure to urban life, to recognize people's dreams of what if, and so I think it's that what if that I know that people experience when entering a market, a farmer's market. It's almost like you walk onto the campus of the market, and you begin to see a much simpler life, one that brings you back to sort of a very ancient time where, where is democracy and the voice of people and their needs? Where are they debated but in the markets? And you get to see a glimpse of this, and then you begin to imagine, well, I wish the rest of my life were like this. Well, how could it be? What other institutions do we need to build? Why is food coming this way and not that way? Why is everything packaged? Why am I eating produce that is shipped around the world through some incredibly subsidized yet externalized means, when I could eat in season and purchase food from people I know? And it just changes. It changes your everyday life, and I think it's this idea of the revolution of everyday life is what inspired me much more so than the sort of the long struggle.
So what should city do in order to make life easier for farmers market and make this experience and joy in the city? Like some key elements.
The key element is to recognize that some of the best ideas are emanating from the neighborhoods, and there is no cookie cutter solutions, and I think this is one of both the strength and the challenge. A city official, an administrator, a public servant, civil servant may visit another town, visit a farmer's market, and say, heavens, why don't we have this in our town? We must make it happen. Well, as a municipal administrator, you could make it happen, but you're not going to be able to do it from uh, probably from City Hall. And that's not true because many cities run municipal markets that are marvelous. But they're big brick and mortar markets. There are some examples. New York City has, I think, probably an unusual relationship between civil society led markets that are run by an NGO. The NGO is housed in City Hall, and has an unusually intimate relationship between municipal administration and the nonprofit market. And there's such an interesting dimension because, and the organization is Grow NYC. It's been in operation, I think, almost 50 years. It's a very mature organization. It doesn't answer all the problems. There are other market organizations as well, but it has that really unusual situation where its interests, its stakeholders are both urban and rural, whereas City Hall's stakeholders are urban. I mean, that's the whole point. So by trusting and listening to civil society and by cultivating leadership among people inside communities, uh, there could be the kinds of partnerships to develop new institutions like farmers markets. They're not the only institution, but they are one because they're public that can lead to the other questions we need. Because we discover that, well, we have a market that's marvelous. Farmers are coming in and selling their products, but people want breakfast at the market as well. Well, we'd love baked goods and pastries. Well, where could those come from? Well, we have some great bakers in town, but they don't have a place to bake, one that is approved by the health department. Well, can we provide commercial shared use commercial kitchens? Well, that takes a lot of resources and investment to sustain them. Well, maybe there are church kitchens, or maybe there are restaurants that are not functioning well, or could open up their kitchens to small entrepreneurs in neighborhoods. Who's going to coordinate that? So I think we need to build the leadership capacity in neighborhoods at a municipal level. Food policy directors in cities is an emerging position in cities. It's a strategy that I think, when it works well, is a good voice for the interests of food and food access and food sovereignty, but it is also works well when it is an office that listens to what is desired in the community as consumers as well as producers. And certainly the rise of growing food in cities is a new idea that's about as old as they come, and the fact that that's being revived also presents some very interesting opportunities.
And tell me more about Think Like Pirates. Tell me like the story.
Well, when I left my legacy of full-time executive inside nonprofit organizations, and realized that at this stage I need to operate independently so that I can write and work on projects that utilize my talents, my skills, but I don't need to be the one who's managing organizations. I began to really think about what are the themes, the threads, the set of values that really inspire me. And I think of pirate radio. I love the whole history of pirate radio, where off the coast, these ships off the coast of England in the 1950s and 60s began to play subversive music, American music, rock and roll, when the formal large broadcasting corporation would not. And the fact that they used the term pirate was so interesting. So began to examine, and being half English, I knew the whole story of when the English Navy under Queen Elizabeth defeated the most intimidating and impressive navy, the Spanish Armada, these large ships that were so large and intimidating at the height of the Spanish Empire that they could defeat all the navies on the seas. Well, when they came to defeat this rather second-rate nation at that point, England, Queen Elizabeth organized these merchant seamen and not even a proper navy, but these small ships that sailed circles around the Armada, the Spanish Armada, and they sunk them. And this became, historically, but I think today, kind of a great example of asymmetrical warfare, that you can be small and maybe more strategic and more powerful than the large institutions that dominate our lives. And you begin to look into the history of the pirates of the Caribbean, the ones that, of course, captured our imagination in cinema. You scratch the surface and you discover that actually the pirates and the Republic of Pirates in the Caribbean were these incredibly interesting. They provided the seeds of democracy, multicultural democracy in our history, in sort of world history. And you could look at pirates at different seas at different times over the years. But the pirates of the Caribbean were multicultural, many ex-slaves, all united against empire. Now, they would plunder against empire, but the way they shared the bounty was democratically. The way they determined who would be captain of the ship was voted on democratically. So the idea that small-scale institutions may provide the seeds of the future and the seeds of democracy and inclusion and pluralism just became a sort of a meme for me. And I'm not drawn to wearing pirate attire. I'm not saying that we should dress like pirates, but maybe we should think like pirates. We should think creatively. We should consider that the solutions are not necessarily the slogan that makes my veins go cold, which is going to scale. Maybe we don't need to go to scale. Maybe we need to scale out rather than scale up. Maybe we need critical mass rather than large bureaucratic institutions. And I'm not naive. I know that the large bureaucracies maintain civilization and stability in our lives. On the other hand, during times of great social change and great ecological change, being large is not a great advantage. Being small might actually be the ultimate advantage. And I was, where the sort of seeds of this for me came in 2005 in New Orleans when Hurricane Katrina flooded my world. And I began to see that large bureaucracies could not respond quickly. It was actually the actions of small individuals and communities and informal as well as formal entities that could be swift and could think and operate very quickly, that's who showed up and who helped shape the future. Now, those windows for those opportunities don't remain open all the time, but they do seem to be open now. They really do, more and more. So that is the idea of thinking like pirates. So that's my blog, my moniker. I operate under that flag. I sail under the flag of thinking like pirates, but also believe that we may sail away and operate on different ships and work with different organizations permanently, temporarily. But at the end of the day, we do also have to anchor together. And so we need flexibility in how we operate and maybe put aside some of our ideological fixed positions and consider collaborating with unlikely partners. I think that's all part of thinking like a pirate.
Yeah. And I have one question. Me as an urban planner, like when we plan future cities, So before we were putting a place for a market, square, public square, and so on. And now with the, like recently, a lot of digital shopping is being like escalated. So how do you see the future? Like, are we going to have these kind of markets, going to buy food and so on, or no? It's going to be also as we do today. Many of us just order by internet and then we just bring it from the box, and that's it. So how do you see the future?
Oh,
And do we really need to plan large space for markets and squares and so
yeah,
on?
yeah. And you asked that question about do cities have room for markets, and in a way, I didn't answer that as carefully, uh, because I think that we don't need large spaces. We actually need more smaller spaces, more crevices where we can soften the lines of the hard city. I'm much more interested in that. So I think for urban planners, um, I think we need flexibility. I think of conversations I had with bankers many years ago, because banks used to be these big, impressive buildings that projected the image that the bank will always be here, the currency will always be here. And now you walk into a bank and all the walls are movable because they're all trying to figure out who's going to work here, how many people do we need in this digital enterprise. And so I think we need flexibility, and I think we need input, so that it is a shared um, process rather than a top-down one. Um, uh, so that we need flexible multi-use spaces. And I think I've been working with the Food and Agriculture Organization in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and we've been looking at the development of new farmers markets in a place that has 300 fresh markets, wet markets all over town, but they don't have the mechanism of direct marketing, of small scale direct contact with farmers markets. Well, the answer to that is not necessarily that we need to build sheds and structures for the farmers markets. Or maybe we do. Maybe eventually you do build a shed, but the shed operates as a farmers market 1-2 days a week. And other days it provides shade for people to sit and for the elderly to have conversations, or for other activities, picnicking, you name it. So the more that we have multi-use spaces where we can have shared ownership over those spaces, that's the kind of cityscape I think we need. The idea, and we've seen it before, where public-private investment comes in to build a big, impressive market, the scale of which impresses everyone. And then it's a dismal failure because the business model doesn't work. These things need to grow organically, and we need to be flexible to accommodate that growth. And as you say, the romance of the box, which puzzles me as maybe someone in my 50s. I love the chaos of shopping, and not knowing what I'm going to find, and not knowing what I'm going to cook until I see what's here, versus the catalog online. But having said that, our lives are changing, and certainly our comfort level with pointing and clicking and ordering our food ahead of time is definitely here. I think the pandemic accelerated its growth, and what we saw, and this speaks to thinking like pirates, the agility in farmers markets all over the planet to recognize that they need a digital strategy for pre-ordering products, whether this is in Italy, where they've developed an online pre-order of your products. Interestingly enough, at Campagna Amica, the organization that runs 1,000 farmers markets in Italy, their website for pre-ordering their products are organized not around the product, but around the people in the market. So when you click through, you're like, oh, I know that farmer. I'll order this from them. So it's interesting what the consumer experience is through the people. In farmers markets in the United States, we saw this amazing phenomena of the drive-through farmers market, I know that in New Orleans, the Crescent City Farmers Market that I used to run ran a drive-through Sunday market where you would pre-order online and then you would pick up with as little social contact as you could to put your product in the boot of your car, and then you drive off. This raises a question that a consultant with the Aspen Institute, who I worked with many years ago, in trying to understand our farmers markets, asked me, is your farmers market just a tool? And it's a tool that connects consumer with producer. And if that tool were to shift, would you close the market? And I remember thinking at the time, this is the most horrifying concept he could present to me. Is like, well, we love the market, the experience, and the physical tents and umbrellas. I mean, are you crazy? And because he said, because what I understand you have is that you have a database. Your database is ultimately what your market is. And I thought about it and I said, well, you're right. Yes, I guess we would close the market if it was no longer useful. And I think the pandemic did that to a certain extent, although during the pandemic, and again, this is the agility in farmers markets, the farmers markets were perceived by many government officials that they were events that were no longer safe, therefore we shouldn't allow them to operate, like other events, concerts, and so forth. And farmers market leadership responded very swiftly and said, no, we're not events. We are infrastructure that delivers food to people. And we are, as the language became so important, we are an essential service. And farmers markets became deemed in many communities around the planet as essential services. And they were services that were able to respond to the ebb and flow of space and people. So they expanded the physical space of the market. If they were indoors, they went outdoors. If they were outdoors but close together, they expanded the space and took over streets, took over space that otherwise was devoted to traffic and cars and sort of the whole Autogeddon that drives our lives. And that kind of creativity to respond accordingly, order online, pick up at the market, drive through, walk through, I think really speaks to that at the end of the day, the markets are a database. They are relationships. They are a proxy for trust in commerce and community. And that is what urban planners should be investing in, is the leverage points that help to build that. Because when you have trust and community, you have commerce, and then you have a place you want to live in.
Yeah. What is your reflection about? Because recently in many of projects, urban planners and architects, urban designers introduced this urban farming on a little scale in order like just to bring people together. Do you think this concept is good or no?
I, as a gardener, and who probably became activated really through gardening first, and then discovered CSAs, the idea of community supported agriculture, which is sort of the Japanese inspired model for investing in the crop at the beginning of the season, and the consumer invests with the producer. It took me down a path to around urban and rural linkages. What we've seen in cities where urban space becomes negotiable, whether it's because of the emptying out of city centers, places like Detroit or New Orleans, or places like London where allotment farms, or Italy, Japan, where they farm every available space, or in the global south with the peri-urban areas, what is urban, what is rural becomes very, confused. But say in Europe, where cities are very dense, it is a really politically important strategy to recognize that we should be producing food in cities. Now, we shouldn't produce food in cities because cities no longer need rural communities to grow their food. To me, that's crazy, naive, and arrogant. However, to have food in cities is so valuable because it softens cities if there are community gardens that are community experiences. Therefore, they're not really about commerce. But we also can have urban farms. And urban farms are extremely important because of the close proximity to the marketplace. You can deliver the food rather cheaply on a sort of food miles standpoint. But then, to your point about what does urban agriculture look like, it has become rather trendy to explore new technologies, vertical farming, rooftop farming, and I'd say that that my concern would be what is the ownership of these models. What is the ecological footprint of these models? What does it mean for biodiversity? If we're growing hydroponic lettuces vertically with some centralized corporation with very little biodiversity, that doesn't excite me. But I think most importantly, everyone who is pushing these agenda tends to have the answer. We all have to do one thing. And I think that I'm not a fan of. I think they're all part of the strategy to reinvent our urban scape and soften the hard city so that the more greenery we have, the better. The more rooftop gardens, the better. The more bees that are attracted to it, the better. The more that it has impact on lowering temperatures in city centers, the better. And I think the other thing that really excites me, especially about urban agriculture, whether it's in the marketplace or outside of the marketplace, the more that we see that food does not come from a vending machine in the sky, but that food comes from the dignity of the labor to work as scientists, as all farmers are, with seeds and the land, and it's a very complex process. The more that we realize how complicated our lives are, and how dependent we are on others, and therefore we begin to respect others. So having agriculture nearby is extremely important, whether it's plant-based or animal agriculture, though there's plenty of necessary debate about animal agriculture, especially because we've externalized animal agriculture as this thing that happens in, like, sort of Anna Arendt's The Banality of Evil, these factories where animals are concentrated in horrible, miserable conditions away from us to see, versus the backyard chicken or even goats and bees. I mean, all of those as part of our everyday life, I think, help to shape our worldview and our relationship to food, that we can't just develop technological solutions to feed us, but that it really is the ancient caring for the land and working with the land, even if it doesn't involve the land, even if it involves rooftops and all these marvelous surprises.
Yeah. And what do you think that cities and planners should stop doing when we plan future cities in relation to food markets?
I think, well, for one, we should stop devoting all of our zoning and time for these big box stores, these giant big box mechanisms, and these horrible corridors of light industrial distribution hubs, and thinking of it as in these mechanical terms. I think we need to integrate them into communities. And so we really need to scale down. And I know that, again, sounds like fantasy when you consider the growth of cities gobbling up the planet. There's pressure with this ethos of feed the planet, that we need more concentration and more scaled up distribution and hubs, that these giant warehouses that we walk in to buy our food. I think that urban planners should not design them accordingly. I think we need to look at the ecology of local economies. What will circulate money and resources and food are small shops and more gardens where people, again, assuming that people have the time to garden. I mean, I recognize that people are squeezed for time, but we need to find more time for people to participate in activity that has nothing to do with the marketplace. And the joy of some percentage of their food being grown by themselves, with their family members. So providing more space uh, for that, and more flexibility for communities to have a say so of what do they want in their community. Um, so I guess, yeah, less big box. It's so lazy. Um, and I think they need to be less lazy. It's less formulaic, and I think, in a way, that there's extraordinary debate underway about public markets of all kinds, whether they are food halls or market sheds or farmers markets. They become a meme unto themselves that, here's a good tool for me to use as a developer to develop a neighborhood in this kind of new urban scape. Like, we need a market in the center, um, and then we'll sell more units and so forth. And I think we have to be very wary of this sort of cookie cutter formula. I don't think there's one way to make the markets. I mean, one of the things that surprised those of us who work in markets is the rise of night markets. And how cool is that to see in the global north this sort of Southeast Asian night market emerge as a whole nother idea about markets, where people eat and explore at nighttime, and that was unforeseen. And I think urban planners need to grow comfortable with the unforeseen, and that not everything can be planned, and that we need to be flexible in that way.
Yeah, it's so interesting to listen to your point of view. So before we go to the next section of this episode, can you summarize for us, like, market cities concept? What is it about?
So many of us who've been working in public markets began to recognize that, for one, what is a public market? What are markets? It's not even recognized as a concept, a sector. It's just this piece of the economy that exists, and we don't really know why, in terms of urban planning. And that recognized that there were elements of successful cities that have markets. And the success has come about, or has resulted from a certain kind of cooperative leadership at the municipal level to recognize that actually there's an ecosystem of markets within a municipality, and that this ecosystem is often competing with one another, is at odds, fighting for resources, that the pieces of that puzzle, whether it's the farmer's market that's run by a civil society, informal street markets that no one's running, municipal public market, even a network of them, they're all pieces of an ecosystem, but they may look at each other as competitive over, access to resources, consumers, and food sources. And that the wisdom that has emerged in some places, in some ways, is what we refer to as a market city. And we've identified 7 elements of a market city. And it, it begins with measuring and mapping how many markets are there. And one of the most extraordinary phenomena is when meeting with a city mayor, and you map out all the markets and the different kinds of markets in the city. And again, these are public markets, so a public assembly of independent vendors who compete with each other for consumer attention. Therefore, multiple checkout lines rather than the centralized supermarket model of checkout. and you show the map of this to the mayor, and the mayor will look at this absolutely puzzled, having no idea that this ecosystem operates under the mayor's authority. And if they don't know they exist, then how can they work with them? So it begins with mapping and measurement, and but then it yields cooperation and maybe investment in not just the brick and mortar investment, but investment in the civic capacity to manage these very chaotic, flexible, exciting hybrids between the informal and the formal economy. This is a skill set that does not really sit well with cities. Cities want to control things. Urban planners want to control things. So it is a comfort level that this ecosystem, these creatures are operating under your aegis, but are an extraordinary asset. And so this idea of successful municipal agriculture, municipal market systems, is also a challenge to the fortress of the city, as our interest is at the end of the city limits and never beyond. This is meant to expand the thinking of the placement of the city within an agricultural region. Is really like the reinvention of the city-state. And therefore, also, what should urban planners do? I think we need to go medieval. We need to reevaluate the town square and the makings of civic life around these human-scaled spaces, and that cities maybe are a collection of these small town squares, and really question the devotion to scale, that we must scale up. I think we need to defend small spaces inside cities and small spaces adjacent to cities, and that our future is based upon how effectively we link up and forge lasting relationships.
I'm really happy that we have this conversation, because you're inspiring me so much, and also for the listeners, because it's important that we exchange, like especially for us working with architecture and urban planning. Sometimes we think we know everything,
Yeah,
but like the reality is something else.
My favorite thing is watching an empty lot. So an empty lot, an unused part of the urban scape that may be owned by someone, maybe owned by the city, who knows? And just watching it, the weeds grow on the lot, watching the pathway that pedestrians work on the lot. And many of them say, I'm not going to walk around it. I'm going to walk through it. And then you see a pathway, and the pathway is determined not by any urban planner, but by the residents who said, this is how this space is useful to me. Now, maybe it can be useful in other ways too, but they're often not asked.
Yes. And now we are in the final section of this episode. It's going to be more about you, Richard.
Uh-oh.
So let's say if you will get $1 million, in which kind of project will you spend this money on, and why?
Well, it's funny. My wife and I often play this game because we never play the lottery. But we pretend that if we did and we won, what would we put the funding into? And she always says, no question, I would create a global fund for fixing and maintaining public clocks, because there's nothing more aggravating than when you see these beautiful public clocks, whether they're ancient, old, beautiful ones or new ones. And if they're not functioning, well, then what the hell's the point of that? And she says, it could be a place where you develop the skill set and all, for maintaining these clocks. And I love that idea. And I'm like, well, I maybe I'd put half of it into that. But I would put my money into travel. I'd create a fund that enabled people in towns. And again, this is also speaking from a North American standpoint where I live, is that people never get to leave their country. Therefore, they have no idea that people live meaningful, fruitful lives in other places, and that they have creative solutions to problems we have that we would never visualize because we've never seen it. And so it would be a fund for exchanges. And I guess what's perhaps, as we are so driven by return on investment and measurable outcomes and impact investing, what would the impact be? I guess the answer is I have no idea. And I think and if I had the control over that, I'd be okay with it. I would not try and steer people to facilitated learning so there'd be certain outcomes. I'd want to find out what they want their outcomes to be, because I think that we are trapped by the constraints we put on ourselves, and our circumstances help to shape that. And I find that the more I interact with others in other parts of the world, the more I realize that they have some piece of the solution. We just don't get to learn from them.
Yeah, exactly. And 100 years from now, what would you love people to say about you or to read about you? Let's say they're going to Google your name.
They Google my name and they find that he loves farmers markets and had something to do with saving food traditions in places that were hammered by illusions of progress, and that he cared about the dignity of the people who grow the food and the people who purchase the food. It probably sums it up to that, though I care about many other things. It is certainly the place where I have learned so much, where I've been forced to reevaluate my ideas and my arrogant urban thinking, and have learned from people who have maybe less formal education, but know so much more than I do about how things work.
Yeah. And now name one thing you're really proud of that you did in your life. Could be a project or activity.
I think being a parent. I mean, it's funny. Once you become a parent, all the other things seem secondary, and I know that's rather cliched, but it's true. But I guess the other thing would be restarting the farmers market in New Orleans after Katrina. It was the most emotional reunion. It was the most symbolic fist against the naysayers. And it was an emotional reminder that farmers who had given up on the city discovered at that moment that their future was based on a relationship to the people in the city, and vice versa. And so that probably that moment, and it's a moment. Fortunately, it still goes on, but it could stop. But still, that moment would matter, and is probably the most important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And name one thing that you did in your career and you regret now when you're looking back.
God, there's so many things I regret, that I look back on. I don't know if I can point to an actual one that stands out above others. There's so many smaller errors I made that all pertain to the question of risk. And this is a great question, and I have a very bad answer because I'm not going to answer with a specific thing that I know is so much more interesting. Maybe I could pull out as I think through this. But I think at the end of the day, I'm thought of as someone who is comfortable with risk, though I think of myself as fiscally, kind of conservative, and I don't take undue risk. And yet, compared to most people, they're like, "Wow, you're high risk." Um, I think that there are moments when I should have taken more risk, and instead, I'm always looking for ways in which people are comfortable with where we're going. And there are moments that I perhaps should have taken more risk and cut ties in order to push through change. And ultimately, my loyalty and commitment to people around me has made me misjudge their comfort level with risk. And I probably there are key moments I should have pushed harder and taken more risk. And so I think that the lesson is to not be fearful of the risk that it takes to make social change. And I mean, I can give you one example, which I know would be much better. Uh, uh, in Gosh, at the very beginning of us establishing the farmers market in New Orleans, I was inspired originally by the Mondragon cooperatives. In fact, that was what I wanted to create, some version of that. Of course, once you do that, you end up creating something very different. And we found that we didn't have the capacity for that. But we did have the capacity for farmers markets. But we saw farmers markets as traditional incubators for small business, for micro enterprise that should be not just rural, but also urban. So we began to develop a project to develop micro enterprises with public housing residents. So largely African American, Black public housing residents in New Orleans. And we developed a project called Riverside Pasta. And it was a job training program where they used the market as the point of sale so as to develop their business. And then the end product is a worker cooperative. Well, one of the participants, uh, had far more experience with prison than work, and found herself in the unfortunate position of being thrust into into jail. And our risk averse thinking was because we had federal funding and city funding, that this was not acceptable, and that if you're in prison, then you're out of the project. And that was my knee jerk response. And fortunately, I had those around me who thought I was correct, and then there were those around me who thought uh, this was completely wrong. This is the reason why we do the work, because it's risky, and because those who have limited set of options find themselves in trouble, and we need to grow comfortable with that. And that was, I mean, in the end, we averted disaster, and she remained part of the program and grew to become an incredible leader. But my instinct was dismissive and judgmental, and was just so naively unaware of just how prevalent and deep um, the problems of interacting with the police force. And this is going back now 25 years. But I often relive that in my mind as my my white privilege was just so evident in how I responded to that issue. And I hope I learned from that. But
What a story.
yeah.
And if your life will be in a book, what is the title of this book?
The title of the book is guess the gosh, I have so many slogans that people get so sick of hearing them, and it's like, which slogan do you pull? Because I do think I think in this way. Uh I think the title is "Think Like a Pirate" or "Think Like Pirates" is definitely the title.
Yeah.
Because I think that defends it. I mean, oddly enough, I have a book coming out with a Japanese co-author this year, and the title is such a mystery to most that it's funny when you think about the title. No, I think the title is "To Think Like Pirates." Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. It's nice that like you believe in this so
yeah,
much.
it's
like,
funny.
You're really your passion. It's you.
It's me. It's sort of my my personal brand.
Yeah.
And
yeah, exactly. Yeah. What are your hobbies?
Oh, my hobbies are.
By the way, are you good in cooking? Because like you work so much with food, and
cooking and gardening are my two most constant hobbies. Of course, it at least gardening doesn't sit well with travel, and my work has, of course, involved so much travel, and that's frustrating. I think it's cooking and gardening, and then any sport that involves a racket. And it's funny right now. I have shifted because of the pandemic. I used to believe strongly in squash. I lived and obsessed with squash.
And now?
And then I had to go to tennis because of the pandemic. You couldn't be indoors. And now, pickleball is a sport that was invented 40 years ago in America. And it's like ping pong meets tennis, or table tennis meets tennis. And there was an article recently about pickleball. Can pickleball save America? And what I love about it is what I love about markets. It's the people, and it's the close proximity of playing a sport with others. But now anything that involves hitting a ball with an instrument is yes, probably my hobby, because it's physical and because you get into the zone and you don't think about anything. And I think that's what most people love about the hobbies. And I feel that about cooking, and I feel that about gardening.
Nice. And what is your daily routine now? What time you wake up? What do you do?
I wake up early and I walk the dog and I feed the birds, and then I start at work early. I think it's always a challenge to have that work-life balance. I never had very good work-life balance when I ran an organization, and I think that's one of the challenges, because we are always in the civil society sector. We don't have enough resources, so therefore we squeeze people, we squeeze ourselves, and that's not healthy. Working as a consultant, I feel like I'm always working and always playing at the same time. So I feel that is much better. But it's strange. When you write, you're at the computer. When you're meeting, you're on the computer. What I dream of is having a stand-up desk so that I'm moving all the time, because I think when I move, I'll get there.
Yeah.
I'll get there. But I do think that our lives have become much less structured, and less structured. I think the lines between home and work are much more blurred, and I think there's a good side to that and a bad side to that, and it really is financial pressures or personal priorities that force us to achieve some kind of balance. But I think having hobbies, I think cooking yourself and gardening yourself are great, because they force you to develop better balance. Because if you don't cook, you don't eat. If you don't water the plants, you don't get fruits from your labor, and therefore that forces you away from the computer.
Yeah. No, that's smart. Yes, and now we are in the last section, and we have 3 questions left. The first one is about you giving a message to yourself. What is your message to Richard?
God, these are really existential. My message is to trust others. I mean, I can preach that, but if you're a control freak, you're a control freak. And I always have to learn how to trust others and allow for them to make mistakes, because that's how you learn.
And the next question is about you giving 3 takeaway messages to the listener.
I think the 3 takeaway messages are: to cook your own dinner, to shop at farmers markets, and to ask your grandparents what they cooked.
Yeah, these are very, very hands-on. Okay, good.
Yeah,
good.
and I guess they're hands-on because I went to a school that had it was a rather competitive, high school, and their ethos, their motto was, "We learn to do by doing," because it started as a manual training school. And the funny thing is that the school I attended was anything but manual training. It was anything but the ethos of we learn to do by doing. It was so academic, and and I didn't fit into the school, but I went there, and the one thing that I think I learned from them was their motto. And I think the motto, "We learn to do by doing," is so much more important than having some coherent ideological concept that we want everyone to fit into. And I think this is why we need to trust others, why we need to do certain things, because when we do things, we learn.
Yeah. And the last question is going to be you asking it to us. What is your question to me and to the listeners?
I guess my question is, are you comfortable being a consumer of food? Or can you carve out space in your life to be a protagonist, to actually be active in finding out where does your food come from having a relationship to the food that you put into your body as something that aligns with your personal values of having trust and relationships with your surroundings. Because there is a terrible disconnect where we say one thing and we do another. And if you are comfortable pointing and clicking and having no idea where the food comes from, well, then are your ideas isolated as something that you can segment into your lives, or is it integrated into your daily life? And I reached a point where I was no longer comfortable with that, and I wanted to know the transparency. I wanted to know because I'm not just a consumer. I am a protagonist, and I guess the question to you is are you comfortable with that, and have you evaluated how much the power that you have as a protagonist?
Yes. And Richard, thank you so much for giving your valuable time to record this episode. And I'm really, really happy that we had this conversation, and I'm very inspired. So thank you so much again.
Oh, well, thank you so much for inviting me. And I really enjoyed the fact that this was not a conversation that I probably have had in many, many years, or if at all, because it was a conversation, not a press conference. And thank you for creating that space, because we need more space to actually to sort of actually get outside of our usual formulaic conversations.
No, but thanks for sharing your story and being so open.
Well, thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. You learned something new and also got inspired by the guest. Don't forget to share the episode on your social media and recommend it to people you think they are really interested in this topic. Thank you so much again for giving your valuable time to Urbanistica podcast. I am Mustafa Sharif. Keep up the good work. Keep loving cities.